April 2025, I'm sitting in the GP surgery. He opens my blood results, goes quiet for a moment, looks up and says, "You back on statins?" I wasn't. He knew that. I'd been off all medication for 14 months. And that question told me everything I needed to know about what the data was showing. I'm Neil, 13 years of NHS blood tests, 9 of those on dual cholesterol therapy, and I came off all medications in February 2024. Today, I'm going to walk you through the entire cholesterol dataset, what it looked like before medication, what happened across those 9 years on statins, and what happened in the 14 months after I stopped. The numbers surprised me. I think they'll surprise you. And the same underlying process driving my numbers is the process most people over 50 are dealing with, whether they've been tested or not. 3 parts to this. First, the baseline. What my cholesterol actually was before I ever took a statin, because without that number, you can't judge anything that came after. Second, the 9-year trend on medication, including the data point I didn't expect to find when I actually laid it all out on a single sheet of paper. And third, the 14-month recovery, month by month, what changed and when, right up to the April appointment where my GP thought I must have restarted the drugs. Let's start in 2012 because that's where this story begins. The mechanism, what cholesterol is actually doing. Before I get into my numbers, I need to explain something that took me an embarrassingly long time to understand. And I say embarrassingly long because I'd been on cholesterol medication for 9 years without properly grasping what was going on. Here's the thing about cholesterol that I certainly got backwards. Total cholesterol is not the number that matters most. Sarah Berry, she's a professor of nutritional science at King's College London and she's chief scientist at Zoe. She puts the mechanism clearly. The way cholesterol moves around your body is essentially a delivery service. LDL is the driver that drops parcels off. HDL is the driver that picks them up and brings them back. What you want is fewer wrong deliveries and a strong returns operation. High total cholesterol with excellent HDL, good return service, tells a completely different story to high cholesterol with almost no HDL. Think of it like this. LDL is essentially a delivery driver that keeps dropping parcels at the wrong address inside your arterial walls where they accumulate and cause problems. HDL is the returns driver, picks up the misdelivered parcels, takes them back to the liver where they can be processed properly. You want fewer wrong address deliveries and more returns. That's why the ratio matters more than the headline number. A high total with excellent return service is a different situation entirely to a high total with almost no returns. My ratio in December 2023 on 9 years of dual cholesterol medicine, 6.15. The target is under 5. I was 23% above target on the medication that was supposed to be managing this. First, the mechanism behind why that happened. Why refined carbohydrates raise cholesterol? The liver connection. Sarah Berry again. This is the insight that reframed everything for me. When you eat excess refined carbohydrates, they get delivered to the liver. The liver can't store them all as glycogen, so it converts the excess into fat, specifically triglycerides. Those triglycerides get released into the bloodstream. And here's the bit I hadn't understood. High triglycerides in circulation actually suppress LDL receptor activity. Your cells stop clearing LDL from the blood. So more LDL builds up, more wrong address deliveries, fewer collections. The statins is working on one part of the mechanism. It reduces how much cholesterol the liver produces. But if the dietary driver is still running, if refined carbohydrates are still pushing triglycerides up, still suppressing LDL receptors, the underlying problem hasn't been addressed. You've put a cap on production, but the system that's supposed to clear LDL from circulation is still compromised. My triglycerides in 2012, 3.4, outside reference range. I was eating what I thought was a reasonable diet. Lots of processed food, cereal, bread, things I didn't think of as sugar. But the liver had other ideas. This mechanism, carbohydrates driving triglycerides, triglycerides blunting LDL clearance, is operating in people years before anyone runs a blood test. It doesn't wait for a diagnosis. Understanding it at 42 gives you more options than understanding it at 52. Inflammation, the factor that makes LDL dangerous. Tim Spector, Professor of Epidemiology at King's College London, pointed to something a large US study confirmed over 30 years. Inflammation was twice as important as cholesterol level for predicting long-term health outcomes. Twice, not slightly more important, twice. because it isn't just how much LDL it's circulating, it's whether the arterial walls are inflamed. Healthy, smooth arterial lining is resistant to those misdelivered parcels. LDL molecules have nowhere to lodge. Inflamed, damaged arterial walls are porous. The parcels get stuck. This is why someone can have a high total cholesterol and relatively low cardiovascular risk, and someone else can have a moderate cholesterol and significant risk. The arterial environment is part of the equation. The number on its own doesn't tell you the full story. What drives arterial inflammation? Chronically elevated blood sugar, UPF, poor sleep, chronic stress, things that were for many years very much present in my life. The Vauxhall analogy stays with me. An old car running on the cheapest, dirtiest fuel for 30 years doesn't break down on day 1 or year 10. The engine keeps going, but something quietly is wearing away. The seals, the valves, the fuel lines, and one day it just stops. A heart attack at 58 that looked like it came from nowhere, it didn't come from nowhere. It came from 30 years of the wrong fuel. The car that gets clean fuel from the start might run another 100,000 miles on the same engine. Your cardiovascular system is keeping score, whether you are or not. As the headline, the most common thing I hear from people in the 40s and 50s, my cholesterol is 7 point something. My GP says I should think about statins. And I understand why. 7 is high. But 7 what? What's the HDL? What's the ratio? What are the triglycerides doing? Sarah Berry again. And this is the one that caused me to sit back for a minute when I heard it. Low-fat diets do not lower cholesterol. They can make things worse. A KCL professor describes still prevailing low-fat advice as nonsense. The reason is exactly the mechanism above. Replace fats with refined carbohydrates, which is what low-fat products typically do, and you're feeding the exact process that suppresses LDL clearance. You're not solving the problem, you might be making it worse. I was eating low-fat for years. I thought I was doing the right thing. My cholesterol hit 8.0 in December 2023. It was sometime in early 2024 after I'd stopped the medications, a few weeks in, slightly terrified about what might happen. Slight exaggeration. And I did something I'd never properly done before. I got every blood test printout I'd had, and there were 13 years of them, and I laid them out on the kitchen table in order. I'd looked at individual results before. The GP would call, say everything was fine, and I'd file the piece of paper. But I'd never looked at all of them together in the sequence. The pattern was obvious once you saw it. 3 distinct phases: a slow drift upwards, a period where the medication appeared to stabilise things, and then, on the medication, a continued climb through to the peak, where you look at the numbers isolated, each one seems manageable. When you look at 11 years in a row, the direction was unmistakable. I'm going to walk you through what I actually saw, the full arc, 2012 to 2025. 2012, first blood test for cholesterol, total 7.5, LDL 4.4, HDL 1.6, ratio 4.7, triglycerides 3.4. Outside reference range, GP note says, need to speak to doctor, statin conversation starts. Atorvastatin, 40 milligrams daily, began shortly after. Now here's the thing about 2012 baseline. Ratio 4.7, within target range. HDL 1.6, decent return service. The total was high, but the ratio was acceptable. 2016, 4 years on statins. Total cholesterol 5.3. On the surface, that looks like the medication's working, and the ratio improved 4.2, but triglycerides still 1.8. Still slightly outside range, and HDL 1.51, marginally lower than 2012, despite 4 years of intervention. The underlying dietary driver still present. 2016, October, same year, earlier reading, different picture, 7 total. This is the inconsistency that starts to tell the real story. On medication, the numbers were bouncing around, depending on what I was eating. The medication was creating a ceiling in some periods and not in others. 2020, 7 years on dual therapy. Statins plus ezetimibe, total 7.3 to 7.4. We are now at a higher total cholesterol than my 2012 pre-medication baseline. The combined medication burden has increased. The number it was managing has got worse. I want to pause on that for a moment because it's the data point that when I saw it laid out, made me think. December 2023, the peak, total was 8. LDL not separately recorded a lot of printout, but inferred high, and HDL was 1.3, the lowest in 11 years of declining trend. Ratio 6.15. 23% above target. HbA1c, 46. ALT, 69. Nearly twice the upper limit. This is the worst that my markers have been. This is 9 years into dual cholesterol medication. GP review at that appointment, everything looks fine, stay on your medications. I stopped the medications in February 2024. Not on GP advice, want to be honest about that. My prescriptions lapsed at the end of October 2023 when I moved from the Isle of Wight back to Yorkshire. And I made a decision, having fasted for 6 weeks properly on whole foods and done a couple of longer fasts. And I decided to stop my medication mid-February. The decision was mine, and I'm not presenting it as something I would recommend for everyone. 1 month of full medication, my total was now 7. My ALT was already down from 69 to 28, back inside reference range. 1 month. I mentioned these results to my GP, and she said, this is better than on statins. And that was the first external validation. I'd expected the cholesterol to spike without medication. It went down within a month. April 2025, 14 months off medication, total was 7.1. HDL though was 1.5, up from 1.3, a 15% increase, and the ratio was 4.7, back inside target for the first time since 2016. Triglycerides 1.4, within range. That was the appointment where the GP asked if I'd gone back on the statins. I hadn't. What I'd done was remove the refined carbohydrates and UPF. You add in the fasting windows and the longer fasts that I'd done. I started resistance training just 3 months earlier. Prior to that test, the HDL rise tracks directly with the training start, and the underlying inflammatory load had been coming down across the previous 12 months, which showed separately in the CRP data. November 2025, most recent, total 6.77, continuing downward trend, HDL 1.4, slight dip from April, but within normal variance, but the ratio was 4.8, triglycerides 1.4, liver function fully normal, ALT now at 10, the lowest in 13 years of records. Total cholesterol is still above the target of 5. I want to be clear about that. I'm not claiming this is solved. What I'm saying is the direction has reversed. The underlying mechanism has changed. The ratio, the numbers that tell you about balance between wrong deliveries and returns, is now at the target it never consistently reached on 9 years of medication. Month 1 off medication, numbers better than on it. That surprised me. Month 3, energy noticeably more stable. The fatigue I'd attributed to just getting older had reduced. I didn't connect it to the medication at the time, but the timing is clear in retrospect. Month 6, HDL starting to move. Month 12 to 14, ratios into target range. GP questions whether I've restarted drugs. Month 21, ALT at 10, cholesterol trend continuing down, all without medication. I wasn't expecting any of this. I expected the numbers to stay the same or get worse. They didn't. I can't tell you with certainty what would have happened if I'd stayed on the medication. That's not an experiment I can run. What I can tell you is what the data shows. And the data shows a consistent improvement in the ratios in the inflammatory markers since February 2024, after 6 weeks of eating 80% plus whole foods, fasting on a regular basis, and not taking any medication. 6 medications, statins, gout pills, aspirin inhalers, allergy tablets, the lot. I stopped all of them in 2024. If documenting that kind of thing properly sounds worth following, please subscribe. If I was starting this from scratch, knowing what I know now, the first thing I'd do differently is ask a different question at every blood test appointment. Not, is my cholesterol okay, but what's my ratio and what are my triglycerides doing? Those two numbers together tell you far more than the headline. The ratio tells you about the balance between wrong deliveries and returns. The triglycerides tell you about what the liver is doing with the carbohydrates you're eating. If your triglycerides are creeping up and your HDL is creeping down, something in the dietary input needs attention, regardless of what the total cholesterol number says. The second thing I'd change, I'd have looked at the actual data trend years earlier, not individual results in isolation, the trend. That evening, I laid out 13 years of printouts. It was the first time I properly understood what was happening. If you have blood test results going back several years, I genuinely encourage you to do that. Line them up, look at the direction, not just the most recent numbers. On the practical side, the things that moved my numbers were removing UPFs and refined carbs, which addressed the liver triglyceride mechanisms directly, extending the fasting windows and doing periods of water fasts, And adding in resistance training, the HDL improvement in particular tracked closely with the start of resistance training. 3 movements, 3 sets, 3 sessions a week, nothing dramatic, but the effect on the ratio showed up within 3 months. Sarah Berry's research shows cholesterol responds to dietary changes within about 10 days. That's quicker than most people expect. You don't need to wait for the next annual blood test to see whether the inputs are shifting. You can test sooner. If you're going to ask your GP for a more complete picture, ask specifically for the total cholesterol to HDL ratio, the triglycerides, and if they're willing, the LDL. The total headline number without those components doesn't give you enough to work with. One important note, if you're currently on statins or any cholesterol medication, please speak to your GP before changing anything. My decision to stop was made in specific circumstances that I made the choice of. It was my health, my body, my decision. I'm not suggesting that anyone else should replicate it. What I'm suggesting is asking more questions about the data that you're being given. If you want to track what I've tracked, cholesterol ratio over time, triglycerides, HDL trend, I've put together a simple biomarker tracking template that works off NHS blood test printouts. Nothing complicated, you just enter your numbers and it shows you the trend. The link's in the description and it's free. A few things worth saying before I go. Everything on this channel is educational. It's not medical advice, and it's definitely not advice to stop any medication. Please speak to your GP before changing your fasting pattern, your diet, your medication, especially if you're on cholesterol medication, blood pressure medication, or anything for blood sugar. Those interact with dietary and lifestyle changes in a way that really does need professional oversight.